The first thing I remember is the sound. Not an explosion, not a scream, just a low, steady hum, the kind that fills every data center when everything is working perfectly. But that morning, something inside that hum went wrong. It shifted, broke rhythm, then stopped for half a second. And in that half second, the whole building seemed to hold its breath. I was sitting alone in a coffee shop 2 blocks away, my laptop open, the same hum echoing in my memory. The shop smelled of espresso and burnt sugar. Outside, the street was still wet from last night's rain, reflecting the early light like it didn't know what day it was. On my screen, a small green indicator blinked twice, then turned amber. That was the first sign. Inside Helix data systems, alarms began to bloom like flowers opening all at once. Authentication servers were rejecting access. Logins failed across multiple government departments. Every terminal that relied on Aegis Protocol, the national biometric security system I had built, started flashing red. Someone inside the control room must have shouted my name. I imagined it clearly. I had trained them to call for me first whenever the system misbehaved. But I wasn't there anymore. I had been fired 3 days ago. My cappuccino was still hot when the first emergency reports hit the public channels. Network fluctuations. Temporary authentication disruptions. No one was panicking yet, but I could feel the tremor behind the words. The people still inside Helix were probably running in circles, checking code, blaming the latest patch, trying to roll back updates that didn't exist. I watched the chaos unfold from a distance, the way you watch a house you once built catch fire, knowing exactly which beam will collapse first. A barista asked if I wanted another drink. I nodded without looking up. On my screen, the logs kept streaming. I wasn't hacking. I wasn't even touching the system directly. I was just observing a heartbeat I had once designed, the digital pulse of something that now belonged to everyone except me. You have to understand, Aegis was more than code. It was a living structure of trust and verification, a chain of mutual permissions where every key needed another key to turn. I built it that way because I never trusted single points of control, not in systems and definitely not in people. That's what made it strong. That's also what made it dangerous to those who thought they could own it. When I left Helix, they took my badge, my laptop, my access, even the office chair I had adjusted to the exact height for 10 years. But they forgot something essential. My name wasn't just printed on my ID card. It was embedded inside the system's architecture, written into the core logic. And now, the system was trying to breathe without me. I sipped my coffee and watched the amber lights on my dashboard multiply. Each represented an authentication request that had failed. One turned into 10, then hundreds. Government terminals across states, airports, defense offices, all trying to verify identities, all receiving silence. To them, it probably looked like a software glitch. To me, it looked like a body realizing its heart had been removed. Someone at Helix would soon call the CTO, then the CEO, and then the legal department. They'd search for explanations, drafts, anyone to blame. They'd bring up my name in those glass meeting rooms, half in anger, half in fear. And at some point, someone would whisper, "Could she have done this?" I didn't. Not exactly. The truth is simpler, colder, more honest. The system wasn't designed to obey everyone. It was designed to obey integrity. And when that integrity was broken, it protected itself. The city outside kept waking up. Cars rolled by. People checked their phones. Life continued, unaware that somewhere in the heart of government infrastructure, the main artery had stopped beating. I finished my drink and closed the laptop for a moment. It's strange how quiet the world feels when something enormous is failing. The second indicator light blinked red. That was when I knew the countdown had begun. I packed my things carefully, like someone cleaning up after a long project. The truth is, I had always known this day would come. Helix wasn't built on trust anymore. It was built on quarterly reports and buzzwords. They wanted ownership without understanding, control without responsibility. When they removed me, they thought they were cutting costs. What they didn't realize was that they were cutting the oxygen. By noon, I knew every agency would start calling. By evening, the first government notice would be drafted: temporary suspension of biometric authentication for security review. And by tomorrow morning, the headlines would start to circle like vultures. I stepped outside. The air was cold and smelled like new rain on asphalt. Somewhere far away, a server fan failed to restart. I didn't smile, not out of pride, not even out of revenge. It was simply the sound of the system remembering who built it. I walked along the river and let the cold work through my coat. When I reached the iron railing, I opened the laptop again. The screen showed a thin rain of logs, each line a voice I could hear in my head. Request, refusal, request. refusal. I watched for 10 slow breaths, then I closed the lid and let the river hold the reflections of the office towers behind me. You can tell a lot about a city by the way it reflects itself. Some places look proud. Some look ashamed. This one only looked tired. 3 days earlier, I was sitting in a chair that did not belong to me. Conference room A, glass walls. Quiet carpet. The legal counsel had a folder with my name on the tab. She slid it forward, then placed her hand on it as if she needed to keep it from escaping. The new chief officer smiled at me as if we were discussing paint colors. We value your work. We are simplifying structures. We have a new vision. We will transition your responsibilities. I asked a simple question. Who will sign off on core changes? He said the Office of Technology would do that from now on. The legal counsel nodded, as if this had already been printed and filed. I thought about the first time I wrote the rule that sat in the center of Aegis. I had been alone in a small room with a single white lamp. The line had come to me like a sentence spoken by a teacher. Never let one hand hold the whole key. Not a company, not a person, not a government. 2 signatures for any step that could change the skeleton of the system. One from the government, one from the architect who built it. I wrote it into code. I wrote it into the contract. I wrote it into my own habits. Back in the room, the officer kept talking. He used words that sound good in boardrooms. Scale, acceleration, modernization. He said Aegis should learn to decide by itself. I said it already learns patterns, but it should never be allowed to decide who has authority. That is a human duty. He looked at the ceiling lights as if the answer might be there. Then he told me the role was eliminated. Effective now. Security waited outside the door. My badge light turned red with a small sound. I put my notebook in a cardboard box. Inside the notebook was a page where I had written a single truth from years ago. People break systems more often than systems break themselves. I did not go home. I went to the coffee shop that had a loose table by the back wall. I ordered something sweet and hot and opened the private backup that I had kept for years. No copies of government data, only the living map of Aegis, the architecture, the rituals. The checks that ask other checks to wake up and look around. There is a difference between sabotage and a warning bell. A warning bell does not set the fire. It listens for smoke and calls the town. That night I added a bell. It was small. It was quiet. It was bound to the one rule that everyone had already signed. When the signature of the architect was removed without the second hand present, new entries would wait at the door and then turn around. No locks would snap. No doors would slam. The building would simply stop accepting new guests until the adults returned with the right keys. I read the line once. My finger hovered over the enter key. I thought of the team. The young engineer who had joined last winter and stayed late to ask questions about time drift in networks. The veteran who always kept a picture of his dog beside the monitor and tested patches as if he were testing bridges. I did not want to hurt them. I wanted to protect the thing we had built from people who admired the idea of security more than its practice. I pressed the key. The bell took its place in the rafters. Now, with the river beside me and the city opening its eyes, I could feel the bell vibrating through the network. Not a violent sound, more like the empty space that follows when a choir stops on purpose. That is why the control room felt so loud today. Silence always makes noise when people expect the opposite. A message arrived on my personal phone. It was short, 2 words and a question mark. You there? I stared at it and did nothing. A second message followed. New profiles failing. Are you seeing this? Then a third. We did not know they would cut you. Please talk to me. I wanted to answer. For a moment I typed a sentence and watched the cursor blink at the end. Then I deleted it. If I spoke now, the story would shift into a shape that would be easy to misunderstand. They would think I had flipped a switch out of anger. They would tell themselves a simple tale about a wronged engineer and a temper. I am not a temper, I am a threshold. Around noon, the first public statement appeared on a government feed. Temporary investigation. No mention of names, no mention of Helix, no mention of me. The words looked like a tarp thrown over a broken window. Necessary for the moment, useless against the weather. I walked back toward the shop. On the corner, a food truck was serving sandwiches to people in suits. A couple argued softly over a calendar. A child in a yellow raincoat hopped over a shallow puddle and looked proud of the leap. I felt the world tug forward. Failure in one room does not stop time in every other room. That is the cruel gift of ordinary life. My own phone rang with a familiar office number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. It shifted to a number I did not recognize. I let that one go too. I ordered a coffee and stood by the window where I could see the skyline. There is a point in every breach where the story tips from denial into bargaining. From there, it moves to confession. I could guess the hour when each step would arrive. You do not need access to see a pattern you designed yourself. The logs continued to fall like ash. I watched one in particular. It came from a small facility near the coast. It was a harmless request to enroll 3 new staff members. The system listened. It asked for the architect's signature. It did not find it. It waited for a beat, a long and patient beat, and then it declined. There would be calls and meetings and slides with arrows and circles. Some of them would be angry. I could live with that. Anger means someone still believes there is a way back. I closed the laptop again and looked at my hands. The first time I built a firewall, I was 12. My father had a second-hand computer that would not stop crashing. I learned that you can make a door open with grace, or you can make it open with fear. Grace is safer. It seems softer in the moment. It is harder to abuse. My name sits inside Aegis in 3 places: in the contract, in the registry of allowed signers. In a comment I left for the next person who would come after me. This line will keep you honest. Do not remove it unless you are too. The afternoon grew brighter. News vans began to bloom near the Helix Tower. A camera crew crossed the street slowly and peered up. I imagined the boardroom, the finger pointing, the long size. I imagined someone telling the new chief officer to sit down and listen for once. I imagined the question that would finally be asked. Did we read what we signed? The phone rang a 3rd time. A voice I recognized left a message that tried to sound calm and failed. Please call back. We can fix this. The rate is yours. The terms are yours. We will restore your access. Say the word. The message ended with a lingering breath, as if the speaker had more to ask but could not trust the room he was in. I slipped the phone into my pocket and watched a jet draw a faint line across the sky. There is a thought that I do not say out loud very often. Power looks like control until the day it is tested. Then it looks like responsibility. The first is a costume. The second is a uniform you have to earn. Evening neared. The amber dots on my private board had become a field of red. Not a single alarm. A canopy. I felt tired, but not from the work. Tired from the part where you must let people discover the lesson by touching the stove themselves. It is an old lesson. It always burns. On my way home, I passed the office district and looked up at the floors where the lights were still on. I wondered whether the officer was staring at a white wall and thinking of the first meeting where he decided to change something he did not understand. I wondered whether someone had found the clause with my name in it and felt the ground shift. I wondered if anyone had said the word integrity and meant it. At the corner, I stopped and waited for the light. The sky was a pale blue that looked almost like paper. I made a small promise to myself. I would not let this story end in smoke. I would build something better, and I would build it in a way that could not be broken by one careless hand. I would write the rule again. I would teach it to people who wanted to learn, not to people who wanted a trophy to hold on stage. The light changed. I crossed. My phone buzzed once more. This time it was not a call. It was a notice from a government account that did not send notices unless a line had been crossed. It said a simple thing: architect authorization missing. Investigation will begin. I stood still for a moment and read it twice. Then I slipped the phone away and kept walking. The system had stopped breathing in order to save its lungs. That is what a good body does when poison enters the room. It closes the door and waits for clean air. I could hear the weight in the distance. It sounded like a heartbeat that refused to rush. The first day after my dismissal felt too bright. The sun struck the glass of the Helix Tower and scattered itself across the street like broken coins. I stood across the avenue with my cardboard box balanced on my hip and told myself to keep walking. People say the worst part of losing a job is the humiliation. For me, it was the quiet. After years of listening to machines breathe, silence has weight. That morning, I tried to pretend that normal life still existed. I bought fruit, answered meaningless messages, even opened a novel I had never finished. Every page looked like code that had lost its indentation. By afternoon, I found myself standing at the same cafe where I used to escape during lunch breaks. The barista recognized me and said, "Rough day?" I said I was between projects. He smiled as if he believed it. I took the seat by the back wall, opened my personal laptop, and let the cursor blink against a white screen. No diagrams, no charts, just the pulse of possibility. Then I opened the secure vault, the one that held copies of design notes and integrity proofs. Nothing illegal, only architecture, like blueprints of a house without the furniture. Each line reminded me of the early years. I could still see the small Denver warehouse where Helix began, the cables taped to the floor, the smell of solder and burnt coffee. Back then, we were 20 people trying to build something that would outlast us. I was the only one who kept notes by hand. My notebooks were filled with sketches of circuits and sentences about trust. You cannot design trust with shortcuts. When I met James Morton, the founder, he had the restless energy of someone who believed in what he sold. He wanted a framework that would unify government identification systems without turning them into a surveillance maze. I told him it was possible if we built it on mutual verification rather than blind authority. 2 locks, 2 keepers, always 2. He laughed and said, "You make it sound like marriage." I told him marriage sometimes fails, but mathematics does not. The project grew faster than any of us expected. Government contracts arrived, the press called us innovators, and investors circled like hawks. Success changes the oxygen in a room. It makes people breathe too fast. When James sold the company, I stayed. I thought continuity would protect the core. I was wrong. The new leadership came with polished shoes and words like synergy. They called me the genius architect in press releases, but in meetings they treated me like an old operating system, reliable but outdated. When they started replacing engineers with analysts who spoke more about valuation than validation, I should have left. Instead, I doubled down. I told myself that as long as the code held, the purpose would survive. That was the first illusion to break. I remember the morning Victor Canning arrived. He walked into the lab flanked by assistants and smiled at the servers as if they were children he was about to adopt. "Beautiful," he said. "We'll teach them new tricks." I asked him not to. I said security systems are not pets. He laughed politely, already thinking about the next meeting. A week later, he brought Ethan Graves, his strategic technologist. Ethan carried a tablet like a shield and spoke in bullet points. He said words like optimization, artificial intuition, predictive flow. I told him Aegis already predicts anomalies. He said, "Yes, but can it dream?" I said, "Dreams are where errors live." He did not get the joke. The afternoon before my firing, I stayed late in the lab. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic sigh of cooling fans. I wrote a short memo about the need to preserve dual authentication for system-level modifications. I attached supporting documentation and sent it to the CTO inbox. I never received a reply. The next morning, the meeting request appeared on my calendar. Subject, alignment review. I still opened it with hope. Inside the conference room, Victor began with pleasantries. Ethan watched me the way people watch a machine they plan to disassemble. The legal counsel waited for her cue. They used the word restructure. I used the word termination. They said opportunity. I said betrayal. None of us changed each other's minds. When they escorted me out, I looked back once. Through the glass wall, I saw the whiteboard where someone had erased my equations. The eraser left faint lines like bones under skin. For a moment, I wanted to storm back in and rewrite them, but dignity is a stronger wall than anger. I walked away. Now, 3 days later, sitting with my coffee and the hum of the city, I replayed the meeting in my head. The exact phrasing, the pauses, the slight tremor in Victor's voice when I asked, "Who will maintain the integrity protocol?" He blinked, confused. Ethan answered instead, "We've updated permissions. Everything is under the CTO's authority now." That was the moment they cut their own lifeline. They just didn't know it yet. I scrolled through my notes. Each rule, each clause, each validation layer was there. A system designed to resist arrogance, to refuse shortcuts. I could almost hear James's old voice in the back of my mind. "You built something that will outlive us," I whispered. "Let's see if it listens." Outside, the clouds thickened. The streetlights flicked on one by one. The laptop screen reflected my face, thinner now, older but steady. I saved the document, encrypted the vault again, and closed the lid. Somewhere inside the labyrinth of Helix servers, the new leadership was already issuing commands they did not understand. The system would ask a simple question. Where is the architect's confirmation? The silence that followed would be the first echo of consequence. I left a bill on the table and stepped into the drizzle. The air smelled of ozone and wet concrete. I walked without destination until the towers disappeared behind me. The future was already moving, quiet and inevitable, like code written years ago waiting for its condition to be met. The night after they let me go, sleep would not come. The apartment felt heavier without the rhythm of code running in the back of my mind. I made tea and sat by the window. Across the street, the neon sign of a small motel blinked between red and blue, like a system testing its lights. I thought of the data center, the endless rows of racks, and the soft pulse of LEDs that had once answered to me. Now they were answering to people who did not even know what question to ask. At 2 in the morning, I opened my notebook. The pages smelled faintly of metal from the ink. I drew a single line that split the paper in two. On one side, I wrote trust, on the other control. I stared at the words until they blurred together. Every system fails when the wrong side wins. It was not bitterness, it was simple arithmetic. When dawn came, I walked to the park. I watched joggers pass, their faces blank, their headphones cutting them off from the world. I envied that kind of ignorance. I sat on a bench and looked at the skyline, the Helix Tower jutting out like a shard of ice. The thought arrived quietly. They think they removed me, but the framework still remembers. Every time someone touches its core, it will look for my signature and find nothing. That emptiness will be enough to make it hesitate. The next day, I called Alex Chen, one of my oldest engineers. He had joined straight from university, bright and careful, the kind who asked questions that made everyone else stop. I told him I wanted to meet for lunch. He sounded relieved to hear my voice. We met in a diner near the highway. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "They're changing everything," he said, leaning in. "Ethan's rewriting modules he doesn't understand. They've stripped half the safety layers. They even tried to bypass the integrity checks." "How?" I asked. "By renaming them," he said and gave a humorless laugh, as if words were enough. I stirred my coffee. "It will hold for now. You sound like you're sure." "I'm not sure of them," I said. "I'm sure of the system." He looked at me then, eyes narrowing. "You left something, didn't you?" I smiled. "I left discipline." He shook his head. "They'll blame you. Eventually they'll have to thank me first." We talked a little more about the old days, about how proud we had been the first time Aegis authenticated across 3 agencies without delay. We remembered the night the servers caught fire and how we worked 12 hours straight with fans and ice packs. Nostalgia is a strange armor. It makes the present feel smaller. When the check came, I insisted on paying. He protested, but I had already stood up. "You'll have more important bills soon," I said. He looked puzzled, but I was already at the door. Outside, the wind carried dust and the smell of rain. I could almost sense the countdown beginning, though I hadn't written any timer. The system's rules were its timer. When the wrong authority touched it, the chain of trust would break itself on purpose. The algorithm would simply wait, refusing all new input until the pattern of legitimacy returned. That was its definition of safety. That evening, I returned to my apartment and opened the secure terminal again. The dashboard was quiet. No alerts yet, but I knew the changes inside Helix were accelerating. The new team was probably uploading patches, improving things. They were moving too fast. When you run across thin ice, speed is your enemy, not your ally. I checked the comments section of the master protocol, the part no one ever reads. My final note was still there. Architect key required for fundamental change. I read it aloud. It felt like a line from an oath. I closed the window and exhaled. There is something cleansing about losing everything you cannot carry. Without meetings, without schedules, the hours stretch wider. I cooked dinner for the first time in months, ate half of it, and saved the rest. The city outside buzzed with its usual electricity. Somewhere in that grid, Aegis was running tests, breathing as I had designed it to breathe, slow, deliberate, resistant to panic. The following morning brought messages I did not answer. One from Helix HR thanking me for my service. One from a journalist asking for background on biometric authentication. One from a government contact marked confidential but unsigned. I ignored them all. I walked to the river again, sat on the same bench, and thought about the next version of myself. I would build a new system, one that could never be taken away. Not because of revenge, but because people deserve frameworks they can trust even when the humans in charge cannot be trusted. I imagined a small company, a team that still believes in purpose before profit. I saw the name form in my head, Kane Integrity Systems. It felt strange, but also right, like a lock clicking. I took out my phone and wrote a short reminder in the Notes app, file registration for new entity next week. I didn't know yet how soon the world would give me the reason to hurry. That night, as rain streaked the window glass, I heard the faint vibration of my laptop from across the room. A notification light blinked once, then went dark. Somewhere, a handshake had failed. Somewhere, the code had asked for my confirmation and received silence. The bell I had placed in the rafters had just started to ring. I closed my eyes and listened. It was not joy, not even satisfaction. It was the calm that comes when an equation resolves exactly as it should. I whispered to the dark, breathe slowly. The words were for me, for the machines, for the whole fragile network of trust that connects us. Then I let the night take me. Night can make a screen look like a small moon. I sat in the coffee shop that stayed open for students and insomniacs and people like me who carry work around like a second set of lungs. The room smelled of cinnamon and overused steam wands. A couple argued softly near the window. Someone laughed into a phone and then covered the microphone when they saw my face. I opened my laptop and the world narrowed to a rectangle of light. First the vault, then the private cloud, then the mirror environment I had kept alive for years with quiet care. No live data, no secret records, only the skeleton of Aegis and the tools that taught that skeleton how to stand. The login accepted me with a calm I needed. Keys like these are not friends, but they are honest. I pulled up the contract next. It was an old copy with my notes in the margins. I remember the day we wrote it, a white room with no windows and a table that reflected the ceiling lights. I had asked for one clause and held my ground on it for hours. The system architect must approve any fundamental change with a second party from the government. 2 signatures, no exceptions. I did not ask for power. I asked for a brake pedal. Aegis could move armies of identity through gates. It needed a way to stop. The text on the screen still carried my pencil marks from years ago, a small star next to the sentence about dual approval. A question mark I had never erased beside a paragraph about emergency procedures. I read the words again. They were simple on purpose. The best rules can be understood by the people who will ignore them. Then I opened the code. You can tell when a system wants to become something else. It starts to reach for shortcuts that were never in the design. It tries to accept a yes without asking who said it. I could feel that pull inside Aegis even from here. The new leadership would push for speed. They would measure success by how quickly a door opens. I had spent a lifetime teaching doors how to say wait. I created a new branch in the mirror. I did not touch production. I did not reach across any line that did not belong to me. I wrote slowly. One line, then another. The bell I had imagined became a small function with a simple question at its core. Has the architect been removed without the second confirmation? If yes, then pause. Do not admit new records. Do not delete old ones. Do not collapse anything. Just sit and breathe until the people who signed this promise return to the room. I read those lines out loud. The coffee maker hissed behind me like a distracted snake. I ignored the sound and kept reading. Each word had to mean exactly what it said. No more, no less. I am suspicious of clever code. Clever code hides knives in jokes. This needed to be plain as a traffic sign. I wrote the log message next. A good system explains itself before anyone asks. The message could not accuse and it could not apologize. It would say only what happened. Architect authorization missing. New entries delayed pending compliance. If someone inside Helix read that line with care, they would know exactly where to look. They would see the clause in the contract that had been there from the first day. They would understand that the system was not refusing their authority out of spite. It was honoring a rule they had once applauded in press releases. I paused and looked around the room. The couple had stopped arguing. The student had fallen asleep on an economics book. The barista was cleaning a steel pitcher with slow circles. For a moment, I wished there were another way. There is always a cost when you let a lesson teach itself. But some truths cannot be handed over like keys. They have to be earned by turning the lock back to the screen. I added a timer so that people inside the control room would see the rhythm of the pause, not a punishment, a breathing exercise. The servers would count in quiet seconds and then present the same question again. Do you have the second hand on the key? If not, wait. The loop was gentle. It would not flood anything. It would not chew through memory. It would simply hold its shape like a door with a shoulder against it. I wrote a note to my future self in the comments. If you return, remember why you left. Do not take shortcuts even when the room begs for them. Then I deleted the line. I have never liked sentimental code. Let the machines stay free of my voice. Testing came next. I cloned a small set of synthetic events that looked like new hires at a harmless office. I tried to enroll them in the mirror. The system asked for the architect's signature. I removed it. The entries waited like passengers whose train has pulled into a dark tunnel for reasons no one explains. The logs spoke in complete sentences. They were firm and calm. Good. I rolled time forward and ran the test again. Then again. The behavior held. I closed my eyes and listened for doubt. It did not arrive. What I had written would never harm what already existed. No badge would stop working. No door would trap anyone inside. The only thing that would change was the acceptance of new claims during a breach of trust. If the people at Helix restored the rule, the gate would open and nothing would be lost except some pride and some headlines. The barista called last orders. I nodded without looking up. I wrote one more function, small as a seal on an envelope. If someone tried to remove the pause by renaming it or burying it under another call, the mirror would raise a quiet flag to the oversight address embedded in the legal framework. It would not shout. It would document. If asked, it would show its work. I saved everything and sat back. My shoulders ached in that familiar way that arrives after careful work. I closed the laptop and let my hands rest on the lid. The bell was ready. It would not ring unless someone pulled the wrong wire. If that wire was never touched, the world would never know the bell existed. That would be the best outcome. On the walk home, I thought about blame. People like to assign it quickly because it gives them a shape to push against. There is a different word I prefer: consequence. I did not break anything tonight. I restored a promise that had been allowed to dim. I made visible the rule that everyone had signed and then conveniently forgot. It is easy to love integrity until it costs you time. At the apartment door, I hesitated. My phone vibrated with a message from an old contact in a government office. It was a brief question. "Are you all right?" I typed yes and added nothing else. The fewer stories I tell right now, the better. Let the code do the talking. Machines are not always honest, but they are honest when you ask them to check a signature. I poured water and stood at the window while the city lowered its voice. A siren passed 3 streets away and faded. A man laughed on a balcony and then remembered the hour. I set the laptop on the desk, opened the mirror one last time, and pressed enter. The change moved into place like a stone settling in a riverbed. The current adjusted. The river kept flowing. People will say later that I set a trap. They will be wrong. A trap is hidden. I placed a bell in plain sight and left a note beside it that said ring only when someone forgets what we agreed. If that bell rings, the sound will not be mine. It will be theirs. I turned off the light and let the room go dark. The small moon of the screen went dark with it. Somewhere far from my window, the system turned in its sleep and held its breath for a count of 2, then 3, then 4, as if it were remembering the shape of its lungs. I slept at last, and in my sleep I did not see fire or falling. I saw a door that knew how to wait. Morning arrived like a slow tide. I woke to a pale square of light on the ceiling and the quiet knock of rain against the window. The laptop waited on the desk. I made coffee, wrapped both hands around the hot cup, and opened the screen. The mirror environment greeted me with the same calm palette. No alerts, no surprises. That was the point. A good safeguard is not loud. It is patient. I checked the audit trail I had written the night before. Each event carried a time, a place, and a signature of its own. Documentation is the kindness you show to the person who must clean up after you. If anyone respectful looked at these lines later, they would understand that the safeguard had not been placed in anger. It had been placed in daylight, inside the rules, behind a door everyone had keys for and then forgot to use. I stepped away to let the code settle in my mind. I washed the cup, wiped the counter, and looked out at the city. My reflection floated on the glass and blended with the motion of traffic. I thought of the first server I ever set up in a rented storage room with a fan that sounded like a small airplane. I remembered taping the cables down, not because I feared tripping, but because I wanted order. Order is the best friend of mercy. If chaos enters a system, mercy leaves. Before noon, I went outside and walked toward the library. The rain was thin, more like mist, and it made the world look newly erased. I sat beneath the high windows and watched people climb the marble steps. A child carried a stack of picture books and stared at the ceiling as if the ceiling were made of stars. I opened my notebook and wrote 3 sentences. Integrity needs friction. Friction slows careless hands. Slowness saves what matters. My phone vibrated. A number from the Helix exchange. I let it ring. A voicemail arrived. I did not listen yet. I wrote another line. People think speed is a sign of mastery. It is sometimes only a sign of fear. I closed the notebook and finally played the message. It was the new officer, speaking quickly and trying to sound gentle. "There are questions about a recent update. We would value your insight. Please call me." The words were careful. The fear was not. I went back to the apartment and opened the laptop again. The mirror showed me a clear stream of synthetic enrollments. I pushed one through. The system asked for my confirmation. I removed it. The enrollment waited, then held. The log added its sentence without heat. Architect authorization missing. New entries delayed pending compliance. I watched that line until I could see it on the inside of my eyelids. It read like a stone monument. It accused nothing. It accepted nothing. It simply stood there and named the absence. People will argue about this line. They will say it was a blade. They will say it was a lock. It was neither. It was a mirror. It showed whoever looked into it the face they chose to wear when they signed a promise. The second call came from legal. Her voice was crisp. She asked how soon I could come in. I heard the clink of a glass in the background and pictured a table with bottled water and printed agendas. I told her I was unavailable. She laughed in a way that was not laughter. She said the company was prepared to offer a consulting rate. I told her this was not a price problem. It was a treaty problem. She paused, then asked what I meant. I said to read the clause. She asked which clause. I said the one with my name. After she hung up, I opened the copy of the contract again and scrolled to the page with the small star in the margin. I remembered arguing for that sentence until my throat went dry. One of the government lawyers had rubbed his eyes and asked why I cared so much. I told him that architects always care about doorways. That is where failure begins. He smiled at the table and signed. I closed the document and looked at the quiet apartment. For the first time since the meeting, something like relief passed through me, not triumph. The feeling had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with not lying to myself. I had built Aegis to withstand error by design. I had now asked it to honor that design. I could live with that. In the evening, I walked to the river again. The water was a dull silver under the low sky. A girl walked past me with a white dog that trotted as if it had a schedule. I checked the small board I had set to watch public signals. One data center reported slow authentication for new staff. Another reported temporary delay in enrollment. No panic, not yet. The bell was ringing with a soft hand. My phone buzzed with a message from Alex. He did not waste words. "Are you safe?" I answered. "Yes." He sent another. "They are trying to rename the checks. They think words will change the locks." I pictured Ethan pointing at a screen and saying that this line can be replaced, this module can be moved, this limit can be tuned until the system agrees to be faster. I wrote to Alex. "Tell them to read the logs." He replied. "They will not," I wrote back. "Then the logs will read them." On my way home, a thought came clear and quiet. I had not created a backdoor. I had created a conscience. A conscience does not stop the heart. It pauses the hand that might crush it. That was the twist inside this whole story. The bell was not a revenge device. It was the most faithful part of the original plan. It simply became visible when someone tried to make integrity optional. I reached my street and stopped at the curb. The motel sign blinked blue, then red, then blue. I took a long breath and let it empty. Tomorrow would be the day the room inside Helix began to fracture. The slides would appear. The voices would climb. Someone would remember the star in the margin. Someone would search for my name. Someone would finally speak the question that should have been asked before any order was given: who is allowed to change the bones? I turned the key and stepped into the quiet. The laptop waited on the desk, the small moon ready to rise again. I sat and opened the mirror one last time. The code looked back at me with no secrets in it. I typed a final note into my private journal, not into the machine. If they had kept their promises, the bell would have slept forever. The fact that it rings means only this. Promises matter. I closed the book. I closed the screen. I turned out the light. In the dark, I could hear the city breathe. The breath was steady. The system would teach its lesson soon. When it did, I wanted my own hands to be steady too. The calls began before sunrise. Private number. Then the main switchboard. Then a number I knew from the executive floor even though it had never called me before. I let the first two slide into voicemail. I answered the third out of curiosity, the way you answer a door when you already know who is behind it and you want to see the expression on their face. The line opened with a breath and a rehearsal. "Linda, how are you? This is Victor." He sounded like he was smiling while standing in a room where no one else was smiling. I told him I was walking by the river. He said he hoped I was warm. I told him it was brisk. Then he began, "We are in a moment of irregular performance." He used those words as if by saying them he could convince the servers to stop reporting what they were reporting. "Some new enrollments are encountering friction. We believe a recent permissions update might have caused a misalignment." I said nothing. He filled the space with a second paragraph. "We value your expertise. We would like to bring you back for a short period as a special consultant. Full access, full support. The terms are yours." I asked a single question. "Have you read the contract?" There was a pause that sounded like someone covering a microphone and turning to ask what I meant. Then he said, "Of course." I said the clause with the star. He said legal was reviewing all documentation. I told him to call me again when he had reached the sentence about dual approval for fundamental change. He began to say my first name. I ended the call before he finished. I stood for a while and watched the steam rise from the river. The city was learning to pronounce the day. Buses yawned at their stops. A runner passed with a dog that leaned into the leash. I felt a calm I did not expect. The machine was speaking clearly at last. All I had to do was let it be heard. My phone vibrated with a message from Alex. The control room looks like a storm. They pushed 3 patches. None changed the refusal rate. They keep asking for a root cause that does not use the word missing. I asked him if he was safe. He said yes. He said he had shown the log message and had been told the message could not be right because it did not serve the plan. I told him to take a break and drink water. He sent me a photo of a paper cup with his name scratched on the side. The letters looked shaky. By mid-morning, a public notice appeared. Temporary delays for certain workflows. Investigation underway. Routine review. The language folded over itself to avoid the shape of a confession. Beneath the notice, a timer counted the minutes since issuance. I watched it cross 15 and felt an old engineer instinct rise. If a timer is the only thing that moves, the design has failed. The second call was not from Victor. It was from legal. Her voice carried the weight of someone used to controlling the framing of a situation. She said there had been an unfortunate series of miscommunications and that the company would appreciate my cooperation in resolving a narrow technical matter. I asked if she had the document open in front of her. She said yes. I asked her to read the sentence with my name. She did not. Instead, she said this is an evolving situation and that all parties would benefit from flexibility. I told her the system does not respond to flexibility. It responds to signatures. She said our new practices recognize the office rather than the individual. I said the contract recognizes the individual rather than the office. Her silence was not long. We can make amendments. I told her amendments require 2 hands. I hung up and opened my laptop on a park bench. The private board was a quiet red field, not flashing, not screaming, just present, like a map of a country that has closed its borders until it can check its gates. I watched a pattern from an air base. I watched a courthouse enrollment. I watched a desk in a coastal agency try to add a contractor at noon exactly. Each request met the same calm response. Architect authorization missing. New entries delayed pending compliance. The words never changed their tone. They did not have to. Another message from Alex. They are attempting a clone of the core and a cutover to a cleaned branch that will ignore the check. Ethan is promising it will work by end of day. I pictured the whiteboard with arrows pointing at words like bypass and wrapper. I typed a short reply. If they move the door, the frame will move with it. He answered with a single period. Then he sent another. Thank you for writing it the way you did. Near noon, my government contact finally called. She did not waste time. We are seeing delay notices from several agencies. Is this a breach or a defense? I told her it was a defense that had been agreed to by her predecessors when they signed the framework. I told her it affected only new enrollments and that every existing authorization would continue to function. I told her it was reversible within an hour if the original rule was restored. She asked me if the company knew that. I said they knew how to read. She did not laugh. She said she would convene an interagency call and requested a written statement from me documenting the architecture of the pause. I told her I would send a plain summary. I walked to a small library a few streets away and found a quiet table by a window. I wrote for 30 minutes without revision. I explained the trigger. I explained the purpose. I explained the limits. I used the word integrity 3 times, and each time it felt less like a slogan and more like a measuring stick. When I finished, I sent it to her secure address and watched the tiny progress bar complete. The feeling was not relief. It was responsibility being set down in the correct place. As I stood to leave, a news alert lit my phone. An anchor on a business channel was talking in a quick voice about a technology firm experiencing enrollment issues. They were already inviting a panel to speculate. Words like cyber event and insider risk and hostile actor floated past. None of it mattered. Panels are weather vanes that think they are compasses. On my way out, I passed a glass case with old maps of the city, early lines that did not know yet which streets would prosper and which would fall silent. The maps looked both wrong and beautiful. They reminded me that every structure begins with a guess and a promise. The guess changes. The promise should not. The third call from Victor arrived as I reached the steps. He sounded tired now. He said the board had asked him to resolve the matter immediately. He said the company was prepared to reinstate me with full honors and a title above the one I held before. He said my name would never be removed from anything again. He said the rate was whatever I wanted it to be. I asked him a second question. "Do you understand why this is happening?" He said, "Because we need you." I said that was not the answer. He said, "Because the system was built with your name." I said, "Closer." He said, "Because trust cannot be outsourced." I said, "Now you are almost there." He asked me to come to the building. I told him I would not. I told him to restore the claws and to stop touching the skeleton of a machine he did not understand. I told him to stand in front of his team and tell the truth. He promised to call back. I crossed the square and sat on a low stone wall. The sky had opened into a hard blue that showed every flaw in the glass towers. I thought of the engineers still inside. I pictured the one who always wore headphones but lifted them off each time someone spoke to him. I pictured the one who used to bring muffins on Fridays. None of this was their fault. They were trying to keep the rain off a roof that someone else had sawed into. My phone buzzed with a new message from my government contact. "We read your summary. Begin no further action. Maintain observation. Confirm that the system will return to full enrollment upon verification of the dual signature." I sent a single sentence. "It will." At dusk, I walked home through streets that seemed to be holding their breath. In the doorway of a bar, a television showed a crawl about investigations and unnamed sources. The bartender wiped the counter with long, tired strokes. A couple moved aside to let me pass. My phone lit one more time. "Alex again." They attempted the cutover. "The system raised the flag you wrote. The oversight notice went out. Everyone is very quiet." I stopped on the sidewalk and closed my eyes. The plot had arrived at the point where the story admits what it is about. Not code, not money, not even control. Consent. Who is allowed to say yes to a change that can alter the bones of a living network? I opened my eyes and kept walking. The night smelled like rain and warm stone. The city lights flickered against the clouds. Somewhere in a room with glass walls, people were reading a sentence with a small star in the margin, some of them for the first time. By morning, the city had learned a new word: delay. It sat under headlines and slid across phone screens as if it were a storm moving in from the coast. I made breakfast and forced myself to eat. Salt and heat help when a long day waits. Then I opened the laptop and let the private board come into focus. The pattern was steady. Refusals for new enrollments only. All legacy access green, no drift, no cascade. The bell was doing exactly what it was made to do. Victor called again. His voice had lost the shine and found the weight. "The board wants a solution today. The agencies are asking for timelines." He asked if I could come in and walk the team through a fix. I told him the fix was not in the code. It was in the room. He said he did not follow. I said to gather the people who had authorized the changes and ask them to read the clause out loud. He exhaled hard enough for the microphone to clip. Then he asked if I was proud of what I had done. I told him pride was not the right measure. Accuracy was. After the call, I wrote a second note for my government contact, shorter than the first. "The system is stable. If Helix restores the dual approval and submits the architect's signature, the pause will lift within 60 minutes. No records have been lost. No doors have locked behind anyone." She replied with a single line. "Acknowledged." Maintain watch. Alex sent a message that made my chest feel tight. People are scared, some are angry, a few are quietly relieved. He followed with a photograph. The control room was full. Chairs pulled close, jackets on chair backs, paper cups everywhere. The wall screens showed the same sentence repeated like a modest prayer: "Architect authorization missing." New entries delayed pending compliance. I walked to the river to clear my head. A rower cut the surface with 2 quiet strokes and then coasted. I thought about how many times in my career I had been asked to move faster, as if speed were the crown and not the trial. I thought about the engineers inside who were now paying the tab for someone else's impulse. I promised myself that if any of them called me later to ask for work, I would make room for them. People who learn from a failure become better builders. By noon, the business channels had found their rhythm. An analyst said this looked like a classic insider event. Another said it was a hostile foreign actor. A third advised patience while his eyes shone the way eyes shine when the camera is on. I turned the sound off and watched the captions crawl. The only caption that mattered was the line on the wall screens inside Helix. That one was real. The legal counsel finally said the quiet part. She called and told me they were drafting an amendment to remove the named architect requirement. She asked if I would be willing to sign. Her tone suggested this would be presented as a routine update. I told her the system would not respond to paper filed after the fact. It would respond to the rule that already existed. She said I was making this personal. I said she had made it personal when she took a rule designed to protect the public and treated it as an obstacle to her calendar. In the early afternoon, my phone buzzed with a secure link. Interagency call in 20 minutes. I joined from the library again in a study carrel that smelled of old paper and dust. 4 voices, one from defense, one from Homeland Security, one from a judicial office, one from a civilian oversight group. They asked for a walkthrough in plain language. I gave it. I told them the system had paused new enrollments because the required second signature was missing and that the pause would clear when the signature returned. I told them the pause had prevented exactly the kind of blind authority we had promised to avoid. I did not mention Helix by name. I did not need to. Defense asked if a cutover to a cloned branch could bypass the check. I said the check lives in the legal framework as well as the code, and that the oversight address would record any attempt to mute it. Homeland asked if an emergency power could be invoked. I said yes, but that the emergency power also required the 2 hands and that the office of the architect had not been duly reassigned. The judicial voice was quiet for a long time. Then she thanked me for writing the rule that way. When the call ended, I closed my eyes and let the quiet pool around me. I remembered the long night years ago when we debated whether to name a person or a position. The room had been split. The argument against a person was risk. What if the person quit? What if the person failed? The argument for a person was risk of a different sort. What if a position became a mask that anyone could wear? In the end, we chose the name precisely because it could be verified. The position could be impersonated by a letterhead. The name could be matched to a key. On the way out of the library, I passed the newspaper stand. Someone had already printed a late edition with a cautious headline. I did not buy it. By the time the next edition arrived, the story would have changed again. Better to read the logs. The logs do not spin, they only whisper what happened and when. The 4th call from Victor came near dusk. I could hear voices in the background and the thrum of ventilation. He sounded like a man standing in the eye of a storm. We tried the cutover. The oversight notice fired. He said it like a person confessing finally to a friend. He asked what he should do now. I told him to stop pushing and to start reading. Read the clause, read the comments. Read the part where you promised to treat power with respect. He said the board wanted me back. He said they would remove Ethan. He said I could set the terms and write the press release. I told him the offer was generous and late. I told him the path forward was simple anyway. Restore the rule. Ask the second signatory to appear. Then wait. He asked if I would ever work with Helix again. I said I would work with anyone who learned what this day was teaching. He was silent after that. Then he thanked me in a voice that sounded like it hurt. Night pressed its face against the windows of the city. The towers lit their crowns. I walked home slow. On a corner near my apartment, I stopped and watched rain gather on a metal table outside a closed cafe. Every drop made a circle that widened and disappeared. That is what a consequence looks like when it is clean. It widens. It fades. It makes the surface quieter than before. At home, I opened the laptop for the last time that day and watched the board. A small change in color at the edge of the map. One site had restored compliance. The message came through clear and dry. Dual approval verified. Enrollment resuming. I felt the muscles in my shoulders let go of a rope I had been pulling for a week. I turned off the screen and stood by the window. In the glass, I saw my face, and behind it, the lights of the rooms across the street. People at dinner. A child building a tower out of blocks. A man washing a bowl and singing softly to himself. My phone buzzed with a final note from Alex. They are finally reading the clause. I told him to get some sleep. He sent a thumbs up and a dot. It looked like a tiny moon. I did not sleep right away. I sat at the table and wrote a list in my notebook. Hire the careful ones. Teach the rule first. Put integrity where a shortcut cannot reach it. Then I wrote a name across the top of a blank page. Kane Integrity Systems. The letters looked ordinary, and that pleased me. Ordinary is what I wanted. Systems that do not make the news except for the quiet reason that nothing bad happened. I closed the notebook and let the room go still. Outside, a single siren passed and fell silent. The system inside the network kept breathing on its own, a little steadier now that someone had remembered how to count to 2. Tomorrow would bring statements and blame and offers dressed as apologies. That was fine. The work was already speaking for itself, in the only voice that matters when machines and people share a promise. A simple sentence that does not change its tone. New entries delayed pending compliance. Then, when the room is ready, a second sentence that lets everyone exhale. Enrollment resuming. The morning did not feel like a victory. It felt like a room after a trial when the chairs are still warm and the papers are out of order. I brewed coffee and watched the steam rise and fold into itself. Then I opened the board. The map of refusals had stopped spreading. Pockets of green had appeared like clearings after a fire, a courthouse in the Midwest, a logistics office on the coast, a research lab that had been careful from the start. Each of them had restored the rule and the system had answered at once. Enrollment resuming. No exclamation marks, just a change in color and a breath that went all the way down. I sent a one-line update to my contact. Recovery has begun. She replied with an acknowledgement and a time for a follow-up call. I put the phone face down and let the room be quiet so I could hear my own pulse. There is a temptation in moments like this to rewrite the past into a clear path. It is not. It is a string across a dark room that you feel with your fingers. The first headline of the day used the word architect as if it were a myth. I turned the television off. I have no appetite for dramatizations where a host leans forward as if truth were a secret that can be teased out by posture. The truth was printed years ago in a contract that anyone could read. The truth was recorded last night in logs that spoke without flourish. A system cannot be bullied into trust. It can only be convinced. Alex wrote to me at 9. The executive floor is emptying into conference rooms. Legal has taken over one. Compliance has taken over another. Ethan is nowhere to be seen. Someone placed a stack of contracts on the center table with my name on half the tabs. He sent a photograph of the page with the star. The ink of the star had bled through slightly to the page behind it. That felt right. Rules that matter should leave an impression. At 10, I joined the follow-up call. It was smaller this time. 2 voices only. My contact and a new one who introduced himself with a calm that reminded me of long halls and heavy doors. He asked me to confirm again that legacy access had not been touched. I confirmed. He asked me to confirm again that the pause was reversible without loss. I confirmed. He asked me to say aloud what the system had sent when Helix attempted the cutover. I read from the log. Attempted bypass detected. Oversight notified. Architect authorization not found. He thanked me and said a short sentence that felt like a hinge swinging. You wrote it correctly. After the call, I let myself sit without moving for a full minute. Sometimes you have to mark a moment by doing nothing inside it so your mind will remember where the weight was set down. When I stood, the apartment felt larger. Victor called near noon. His voice carried the rough edge of someone who had slept in his office chair. He said the board wanted a statement that would calm investors, clients, employees, and the mirror that hangs behind all of them. He asked me to return and stand beside him while he read it. He said my presence would restore confidence. I asked if the clause had been restored everywhere and verified. He said almost. I told him almost is not a signature. He said he understood. He said he would call me back in an hour. I made lunch and ate it standing at the counter like an intern on a first week. Humility is good for the appetite. While I ate, I thought about consequence in systems and consequence in people. A system that refuses new claims during a breach of trust is not punishing. It is protecting the shape of what is true. A person who refuses to decorate a failure with a lie is doing the same. I decided that if Victor read an honest statement, I would answer questions afterward, not for Helix, for the engineers and the agencies who deserved a steady voice. The message that arrived next did not ask, it informed. From this hour, the Oversight Office would require a formal attestation of compliance before lifting the remaining pauses. The form was simple. 5 fields, 2 names, 2 keys, a time, a place. I smiled at the brevity. Strong rituals do not need ornament. In the early afternoon, my doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone. I opened it to find no one in the hallway, only a large legal envelope propped against the frame. There was no logo. Inside was a non-disclosure agreement and a letter from the Helix Interim Council offering a role with a title I had never wanted and terms that assumed I had been waiting for this invitation since birth. I read the first paragraph twice to be sure I had not missed a sentence where they apologized for forgetting what words are for. Then I placed the letter back in the envelope and slid it under a stack of books. Some offers are just a mirror that shows you what you will not become. At 2, my contact sent a short update. 2 agencies fully cleared, 3 processing, 1 holding for internal review. The one holding was the same office that had pushed the first sloppy change months ago. I knew their style, speed first, blame later. I wrote a line for myself in my notebook. If a habit breaks trust, call it risk, not culture. The phone rang again, not Victor, a voice I had not heard in years. The founder, James. He had left after the sale to buy a ranch where the sky is large enough to remind a person of scale. He said he had watched the news with a knot in his chest, and that the knot had loosened when he read the line about dual approval on a screen grab someone had posted. He said he remembered the day we argued for it. He said he should have fought even harder back then to put the principle into the walls instead of just into the paperwork. I told him the walls remembered anyway. He laughed softly and asked what I planned to do next. I told him I would build a company small enough to think clearly and strong enough to stand up when crowded. He said he wanted to invest. I said I would send him a plan when the smoke cleared. I felt lighter after we hung up, the way you feel lighter when someone who knew you before the noise says your name like a fact. Late afternoon brought the first public confession from Helix. The statement was short and unexpectedly plain. It named the clause, it named the error. It named the remedy, no euphemisms, no decorative fog. I read it twice and then a third time. Someone in the room had finally chosen integrity over tone. The statement ended with a promise to restore the rule and to cooperate with oversight in full view. The last sentence asked for patience and thanked the agencies for theirs. It was the right order. My phone filled with messages from numbers I did not recognize, former colleagues, vendors. 2 reporters I had not spoken to in years. I ignored them and wrote a short note to Alex. The statement was clean. He wrote back that the room had been very quiet while it was drafted. He said that after it was sent, people stopped talking over each other. He said a senior engineer had stood up and, in a steady voice, read the log line out loud. The act sounded ceremonial. It should have been. As the sun lowered, the city turned to brass. I walked to the river with the laptop under my arm and sat on the same bench where I had watched the first refusals fall like snow. I opened the board and watched the red shrink toward the edges. Green filled the map in patient strokes. One by one, the sites confirmed the return of the second hand on the key. The message changed accordingly. Dual approval verified. Enrollment resuming. The system did not cheer. It did not need to. Its work was in the silence that follows restraint. A pair of teenagers sat on the bench behind me and argued about music. Their voices rose and fell with a rhythm that made me smile. Ordinary life was practicing again. I closed the laptop and leaned back. The cool wood pressed through my coat. The river moved as if nothing had happened, which is the point of a river. My phone buzzed with a final update from oversight for the day. Restoration at 91%. Remaining sites scheduled for morning review. Please maintain observation until completion. I sent back a single word, observing. Then I wrote another line in my notebook. When the mirror is clean, everyone can see who is in the room. Dusk gathered. I walked home slowly and stopped at a corner store for bread and tea. The clerk counted my change with a care that calmed me. Care is a form of respect. At home, I ate a simple dinner and left the dishes in the sink. The board glowed softly on the desk. I watched it until the last red island disappeared on the coast. The map was green end to end. I turned off the screen and stood at the window. Far below, a cyclist crossed the street with a blinking light that pulsed like a small heartbeat. I began to outline the first page of the plan for my new company, not the metrics, not the market. The oath, put integrity where speed cannot touch it. Name the hands that must agree. Teach the habit of reading the rule before reading the clock. The night held steady. I slept with the window cracked, and the city breathed in and out, and nothing fell. At sunrise, the board showed a single ribbon of red along the federal spine that ran through the Capitol. Everything else was green. That ribbon was the last place holding out, a set of offices that had turned velocity into a style. I made tea and waited. The water steamed and then calmed. When the phone rang, I knew it would be the call that decided whether the day ended in noise or in order. It was the oversight chair. Her voice had the careful cadence of someone who knows every word will be kept. "We are convening a brief session," she said. "Your presence is requested to answer questions of fact." She gave a time and a room number, and then asked if I required counsel. I said I required a glass of water and a working projector. She said both would be provided. I put on a dark suit I had not touched in months and walked the long blocks toward the stone building that keeps the quiet parts of government alive. Security was polite. The halls were cool. In the anteroom, an assistant handed me a lanyard with my name in black letters. My name looked smaller than I remembered, and that pleased me. Names should not take up too much air in rooms like this. Inside the chamber, there were 2 rows of desks and a narrow table for guests. I sat there and placed my notebook beside the microphone. Behind me, I heard the soft shuffle of people taking their seats. The chair called the session to order and read a paragraph that stated why we were there. A national system had paused new enrollments in accordance with a rule designed to prevent unilateral change. The chair said the purpose of the session was to confirm the design of that rule and the conditions for restoring full function. Then she nodded to me. I spoke as plainly as I could. The system required 2 hands for any step that could change its bones. 1 hand from a government office designated in the contract. 1 from the architect named in the contract. The rule did not expire when a company reorganized. It did not migrate to a desk by assumption. It could be reassigned only by a process that produced a new named signer, and that process had not been completed. When the company attempted to remove the rule in software without completing the contract process, the system delayed new enrollments and recorded the attempt to an oversight address that cannot be muted. The chair asked me to repeat the last sentence. I did. A man from the Capitol offices leaned toward his microphone. He asked if the delay could be considered punitive. I said no. I said the delay prevented damage by refusing to accept claims that could not be verified under the rules. Existing access continued uninterrupted. Doors stayed open for those who were already inside. He asked if any harm had been done. I said the only harm was impatience. The chair did not smile, but her eyes softened. A staff attorney rolled a cart to the front and connected a projector. My summary appeared on the screen. It was brief. At the center was the log line the whole city could quote now without looking. Architect authorization missing. New entries delayed pending compliance. I advanced the slide to show the clause in the contract with the small star in the margin. The camera in the ceiling clicked softly. The words showed clean against the white. The chair asked me to read them aloud. I did. The room felt taller when I finished. Then the plot turned. The clerk at the end of the dais stood and read from a note that had just arrived from an internal audit. The company had attempted a cutover to a cloned branch. The cloned branch had attempted to rename the integrity check. The rename had triggered the oversight notice that was now part of the public record. The clerk continued. The notice had been delivered not only to oversight, but also to the security team at the Capitol as specified by the original award. The clause that named the architect had been affirmed by that team 7 years ago with a separate memo that stated the reason directly. We require a human custodian who understands the skeleton of the system. A low murmur moved through the room and then stilled. The chair asked the clerk to repeat the last sentence. We require a human custodian who understands the skeleton of the system. She let the words stand for a few breaths and then said thank you. I watched the faces at the back. 2 of them were from Helix. They looked as if a door had opened to a hallway they did not know existed. The legal counsel avoided my eyes. The executive stared at the screen with a focus that told me he was finally reading rather than waiting to speak. The moment felt clean, not cruel. Clean. The chair turned to me again. If the second hand appears, will the system return to full enrollment without further delay? Yes. If the office of the architect is reassigned correctly, will the system accept the new signer? Yes. Did you design this with an intent to harm a company? No. I designed it with an intent to protect a nation. The chair nodded once, then asked if I had anything else to add. I said only this. Systems that move the identity of a country should not be allowed to change their bones in a single breath. The session ended with a short directive. The relevant offices would complete the reassignment process if they wished to name a new architect. Until then, the original rule stood. The company would file an attestation that the clause had been restored in software and in practice. Oversight would verify and then issue a resumption notice. The gavel touched wood. The room exhaled. In the corridor, the Helix executive caught up to me. He looked older than 2 days ago. He said he had read the clause and that he had read the memo from the Capitol and that he had read my summary twice. He said he had been wrong. He did not offer money. He did not offer a title. He offered a sentence without decoration. You wrote it right. I said I had help. Then I walked away. Outside, the air felt renewed. I crossed the square and bought a paper out of respect for the person who still sets type with their hands. I did not read it. On a bench near the fountain, I opened the laptop and watched the last ribbon of red shrink as the Capitol offices filed their attestation. A minute later, the message changed. Dual approval verified. Enrollment resuming. I took a picture of the screen and then deleted it. Some souvenirs do not need to live in a pocket. My phone buzzed. Alex, it is done. People applauded in the control room. No one cheered. It was not that kind of applause. He sent another message. They are asking who wrote the old memo. I wrote back, people who understood what we were building. He said thank you for making it teachable. I told him to go home. Afternoon leaned toward evening. I walked the long way beside the river. Water lifted and fell. Bridges held. The city sounded like patience again. At a small table outside a bakery, I wrote the first page of the plan for my company. I wrote it as a pledge rather than a prospectus. We will design frameworks that refuse to forget their own promises. We will never sell speed that breaks trust. We will put decisions in rooms where two careful people must agree. We will log every act in words a human can understand. I signed my name at the bottom and felt the same quiet certainty I felt the night I wrote the bell. When I reached home, there was one more envelope at my door. No logo. Inside was a letter from the oversight office. It thanked me for my cooperation and asked whether I would consider presenting a short lecture to a group of new analysts on the subject of dual authority in critical systems. I read the letter twice. Teaching is a way to make a victory permanent. I wrote yes in the margin and set the letter on my desk. The board was fully green now, no breath caught, no line waiting. I turned the screen off and stood in the dim room. Across the street, a family sat down to dinner. Someone poured water. Someone laughed. Someone lifted a fork and hesitated, listening to a story that had reached its good part. I felt a stillness move through me that did not feel like an ending. It felt like alignment. The plot twist had not landed like a drum, but like a compass needle falling into place. The name in the contract was not a throne. It was a promise. When they tried to move it, the system held up a mirror and asked everyone to look. They looked at last. The mirror did its quiet work. And the day ended the way a good day should end in a world that still wants to stand. With the gates open for those who belonged there. With the rules visible to anyone who cared to read. With the next chapter already writing itself in a clean hand on a blank page. The morning light cut across the brick of the office like a hand reaching in. Kane Integrity Systems. I typed the names slowly, watching the letters appear as if they had never existed before. A new company, yes, but more than that. A promise. A place where rules mattered more than urgency, where trust was not optional. I signed the digital forms and sent them off. Confirmation arrived within minutes, the tone calm and neutral. That was exactly how I wanted it. I moved into the small office above the bakery. The smell of cinnamon lingered faintly, mixing with the scent of old brick and varnished wood. 2 desks, 4 chairs, a whiteboard, and a kettle. That was enough. That would be enough to start. I placed the laptop on the table and let it breathe beside a notebook I had brought from home. The notebook carried a rule I had written years ago: integrity before action. Every word still held its weight. Alex arrived first, careful as ever, notebook ready. He looked around and smiled. It's smaller than Helix. I nodded. It is supposed to be. The smaller the room, the louder the principle. We shook hands and began unpacking the first boxes. Servers, cables, a single rack to organize the network quietly. Each piece we touched was a rehearsal. I explained the purpose of each cable and why it mattered that nothing be installed faster than it could be verified. The second hire, Priya, came in with a plant in a chipped pot and a folder of notes. She had been with Helix long enough to know how to protect engineers from blame without getting caught herself. She placed the plant by the window and said quietly, "This is going to be a different kind of office." I told her yes, that was the point. It had to be a place where people could see the rules clearly, follow them carefully, and learn to say no without fear. Matteo arrived last. Calm, steady, the kind of operator who treats servers like instruments and networks like living systems. I asked him about the edge nodes, the power management, the fail-safes. He answered in sentences that felt like bridges. We spent an hour laying out a small sandbox, a controlled environment to test integrity triggers, to watch how the system would react when someone attempted a shortcut. The edge, I explained, is where promises are tested first. If a rule bends there, the core bends too. We agreed silently. We sat around the table and wrote the oath. Not a mission statement, but a set of principles. We will not trade speed for trust. We will require 2 independent signatures for every change touching critical structures. Logs will be human-readable. We will rotate custodians to prevent concentration of power. We will design for graceful refusal. Each principle was short, plain, visible. We signed with deliberate strokes, each name a commitment. I drew the first framework of Strand on the whiteboard. It would replace the idea of a single architect with a circle of custodians. Each custodian came from a separate institution. Each critical act required a threshold of signatures. Minor updates might need 2, major structural changes required 4 or 5, drawn from different agencies with no common sponsor. Transparency in rules, verifiable builds. The logs explained each decision in plain sentences. The comments in code did not wink or obfuscate. Every step had an explanation. Every failure left a trace. Priya suggested an integrity trigger at the edge, a guard that would act before anyone reached the core. Matteo implemented a first mock. Alex wrote test scripts that ran through dozens of scenarios, pushing boundaries, asking questions like a stern examiner. I watched the triggers behave exactly as intended. They paused, they rejected, they reported. No alarms, no drama, just obedience to principle. We paused mid-afternoon. I poured water into cups and watched the steam. A building, a system, a team all need moments to breathe, to let the structures settle. I reminded them that our goal was not to impress anyone but to build something that would work when attention wandered, when leaders changed, when decisions were rushed. The work itself had to be honest. Late afternoon brought a secure message from oversight. An exploratory request for proposals would be issued next month. I read it silently, smiled, and folded the note into my pocket. Strand would be ready. The letters of its name were not bold, not loud, just true. That is all a system needs to be when it carries the weight of trust. By evening, the stairwell above the bakery was quiet. We powered down the laptops, checked that all scripts were paused safely. The edge triggers were alive, waiting for any attempt to bypass them. I looked at the whiteboard and traced a finger over the circles representing the custodians. One circle, many hands, one name, multiple observers. The skeleton of a system built to survive the ignorance of those who think they own it. The city outside hummed and pulsed. The office smelled faintly of coffee, of brick, and of beginnings. I closed the door and felt the promise of a system that would be cared for rather than rushed. Tomorrow we would continue. Today, the principle had settled. Morning came soft and gray. I arrived early, carrying nothing but my notebook and the small black case with spare drives. Alex was already at the desk, humming to himself while reviewing test logs from yesterday's sandbox run. Priya had a coffee cup in hand, eyes scanning the whiteboard circles, each custodian already named, each rule double-checked. Matteo adjusted a cable rack as if aligning the universe itself. The office felt alive, not from machines, but from care. I poured myself a cup and took a slow sip. The edge triggers we had implemented were still holding steady. Any attempt to bypass them would raise a notification to the oversight address, and I had already verified that the logs were human-readable, unambiguous, and unalterable without leaving a trace. Integrity does not announce itself loudly. It whispers in code, in compliance, in the pauses of a process that no one may yet understand. We began the first official team review. I laid out the schedule for a simulated breach exercise. Each of us had a role. Matteo would run the network simulation, Priya would create attack scenarios, Alex would monitor the logs and responses, and I would observe the flow, noting moments where human judgment was required. The purpose was simple: ensure the system responded as intended without anyone having to override it. The first simulation involved a routine attempt to push a minor update to multiple endpoints. The system paused the enrollment because one custodian's signature was missing. Matteo and Alex checked logs, Priya monitored triggers. Everything worked as intended. We paused and I asked, "Would you have noticed if this happened in a live environment?" They all nodded. Observation is a skill that comes only from attention, not from power. Next, we simulated a partial breach. Someone inside tried to rename a function to bypass authorization. The edge triggers engaged immediately, prevented the action, and recorded the attempt with a timestamp and a reference to the clause in the oath. No damage was done. The room was quiet, a silence of satisfaction, a rare sound. I reminded them that the system was not punishing, it was protecting itself and the people who depended on it. Alex then suggested a small modification to the test suite: add random timing to actions to simulate human error. Priya nodded and started writing scenarios. Matteo recalibrated the network so that each simulated node behaved independently. I stepped back and watched them work. Coordination is easy to theorize, but hard to achieve under pressure. They learned today that attention to detail is more valuable than rapid execution. Mid-morning, my phone buzzed with an encrypted message from oversight. They were reviewing the Strand framework remotely and requested a short briefing. I replied with available times. They wanted assurances that dual authorization and integrity triggers functioned as described. I told them that the system had already undergone live simulation with edge triggers fully operational. No one would be able to bypass the rules without leaving a trace. During the briefing, I walked them through the first diagrams on the whiteboard. I explained the principle of rotating custodians, the thresholds for critical actions, and the decision flow for minor versus structural updates. The oversight officials asked questions, clarifying points they would eventually reference in policy documents. I kept the answers simple and precise. Complexity invites mistakes, clarity preserves trust. After the call, I returned to the sandbox with the team. Priya simulated an unexpected failure in one node. Matteo tracked the chain reaction. Alex checked logs for consistency. I monitored the system's response, ensuring every alert was accurate and every pause justified. We did not speak much. The work required concentration, not commentary. Lunch was quiet, sandwiches eaten while reviewing notes. I explained the plan for documentation. Every rule, every test, every threshold would be recorded in a way that even someone unfamiliar with the system could verify outcomes. Transparency is not just a virtue, it is a shield against misinterpretation and blame. By mid-afternoon, we began the first combined exercise. All elements of Strand were active: rotating custodians, edge triggers, verification logs, and simulated attack scenarios. The system handled each case correctly. Minor errors were caught, paused, and flagged. Critical errors would have required a minimum of 4 custodians confirmation. Nothing slipped through. The team took careful notes. I reminded them that mistakes are lessons when discovered by design rather than by accident. As evening approached, we paused for reflection. Each team member shared observations about the system's behavior and proposed small improvements. Nothing was implemented without review. The room felt disciplined, alive, and careful. I realized the first day had succeeded, not because we built something perfect, but because we built something predictable and teachable. Before leaving, I wrote in my notebook, begin with principles, not speed. Verify each act, preserve the ability to refuse. Build the system for the people, not the schedule. Strand is not a monument, it is a practice. Tomorrow we will test new custodians, add more edge simulations, and begin drafting formal guidelines. Tonight I left the office with a sense of quiet accomplishment. The city lights reflected in the window like 1,000 green dots. Each one, like our systems, capable of alerting, pausing, and holding truth steady. I locked the door and took a slow walk back, counting my steps between streetlights. Each step measured, deliberate. The system would breathe through the night, safe under the hands we had placed. And in the quiet, I let myself feel the steady pulse of beginnings. The morning air was cool, damp from overnight rain. I arrived at the small auditorium reserved for the government briefing with a notebook, a laptop, and a calm that had taken years to cultivate. Strand was fully operational, and the edge triggers had been monitored overnight by a team of engineers who trusted them more than any memo. Today, I would present not a system, but a lesson. The audience consisted of new analysts, oversight officers, and a few senior engineers from various agencies. They were polite, attentive, eager for guidance, yet I could sense the expectation of spectacle. I put the laptop on the podium and opened my notes. I began simply, "Good morning. Systems are only as trustworthy as the people who maintain them. The architecture you design must reflect your principles, not your haste." I walked them through Strand, starting with rotating custodians, the thresholds for critical updates, and the edge triggers that acted as the conscience of the network. I showed how a node attempting unauthorized change would pause, report, and document the attempt. "Notice," I said, "that the system does not punish, it protects. It waits for the right hands to act. Consequence arrives not from revenge but from design." One analyst raised her hand. "What if someone tries to bypass the check?" I smiled. "We'll trigger a notice. The logs are human-readable. Every misstep writes itself clearly. Systems cannot forgive a missing signature if the process requires one. That is not cruelty, that is clarity." I demonstrated a simulated enrollment, showing the pause when one custodian's authorization was absent. The logs recorded exactly what happened. I let the room read them silently. Understanding comes quietly when it is earned, not announced. Another question: isn't this slowing progress? Nodded. Yes, that is the point. Speed without verification is risk. A system that allows mistakes faster than they can be corrected is not efficient, it is dangerous. Your job is to measure risk and prevent it. Strand does that by requiring human judgment where machines alone cannot be trusted. I paused and looked around the room. The analysts nodded. The oversight officers typed notes. No one fidgeted. That stillness was worth more than applause. I continued with the principle of dual authorization. Every structural change requires signatures from 2 independent custodians. This ensures that no single person can alter the system unilaterally. You may think it slows you down. It does. But a single error can take years to repair. The extra time upfront saves years of consequence later. Questions came from various agencies: how to rotate custodians, how to document approvals, how to test edge triggers. Each question I answered with examples from the simulations we ran, stories of hypothetical failures that could have been catastrophic, but were prevented because the system obeyed rules rather than haste. At one point, a senior engineer asked, "What about legacy systems?" I said, "Treat them as a foundation, not a crown. Do not decorate them with shortcuts. Strand can integrate, but only if you preserve the principles that protect it. Otherwise, it will pause and wait for compliance." By mid-morning, I could see comprehension settling across faces. I stopped showing screens and closed the laptop. "Remember," I said, "the system's integrity is only as strong as the discipline of those who maintain it. Machines can enforce rules, but humans must understand why the rule exists. Teach this first. Teach it always." I ended with a small demonstration of a simulated breach attempt. The system paused a node, flagged it to oversight, recorded the attempt in plain language. Everyone read the logs. They understood without me saying much more. That is how you teach integrity. Not with grand speeches, not with fear, with evidence that cannot be ignored. When the session concluded, people lingered to ask individual questions. I answered patiently. I let the lesson continue quietly through conversation, through examples, through encouragement. Some took notes. Some looked thoughtful. Some would write memos, others would run simulations. I did not care which. I only cared that the principle persisted. Outside the auditorium, I walked the steps slowly, letting the cool wind touch my face. The city was awake, streets humming. I thought about the weeks that brought me here: the refusal of Helix to respect the architect clause, the pause, the oversight, the formation of Kane integrity systems. Each step had been deliberate, measured, unavoidable. I had not sought revenge. I had sought trust. I arrived at a small cafe across the street and ordered tea. My notebook lay open beside me. I wrote a single sentence: "Systems must be trustworthy, not only obey commands." I underlined it twice. That sentence would guide our next design review, our next simulation, our next training session. Integrity is a practice, not a decoration. By late afternoon, the first reports from the field arrived. All new entries processed with full verification. The system responded exactly as intended. I allowed myself a small smile. Not pride, not triumph, but satisfaction. The lesson was functioning. The sun began to lower, casting long shadows through the cafe windows. I closed my notebook. Tomorrow we would continue. Strand would continue. And the code of integrity, written carefully and tested patiently, would continue to teach those who were willing to learn. The next morning I arrived at the office early. Strand was already humming quietly, its edge triggers patrolling silently, logs ready to record without judgment. I poured coffee and watched the amber lights of the small servers blink in rhythm. Each pulse was a heartbeat I had written into the system years ago, now alive and observing. I began the session with the new analysts, oversight officers, and engineers who had joined us since the first day. The room was quiet. Everyone knew the purpose: to see the system, to understand the rules, to learn the lesson embedded in every line of code. I opened my notebook. "Today," I said, "we are not talking about speed. We are not talking about headlines or titles. We are talking about responsibility. Every action you take has a consequence, and the system is designed to ensure you see it clearly before it spreads." I demonstrated a simulated breach attempt. A node tried to change a critical parameter without proper authorization. The system paused it immediately. A log message appeared: "Architect authorization missing." New entries delayed pending compliance. I let the room read the log. Their eyes moved slowly across each word. The silence spoke louder than my voice. One analyst asked, "What if someone ignores the log?" I nodded. Then the oversight notification fires. The system leaves a trail. Consequence is inevitable if the rules are broken. But observe carefully. The system does not act out of anger or revenge. It acts to preserve integrity. That is the difference between a law enforced by fear and a system that teaches responsibility. I walked the group through rotating custodianship. Each custodian came from a separate institution. Each critical action required multiple signatures, thresholds adjusted to the risk. I explained the principle of edge triggers, how they detect an attempt before it reaches the core. Every rule had a purpose, every delay a lesson. We tested one minor change. The pause triggered. Logs recorded everything. Everyone in the room understood immediately. Next, we simulated a larger structural change, one that could affect multiple agencies. 4 custodians signed. 2 were human, 2 simulated for the exercise. The system responded correctly. If anyone had tried to bypass it, the logs would have recorded the attempt for oversight review. I paused and let the room absorb this. This, I said, is what prevents catastrophe. Not fear, not surveillance, not drama, discipline and transparency. Questions came. What about legacy systems? I explained that Strand treats legacy systems as foundations. They are to be respected and verified, not bypassed. Speed cannot be trusted, I said. Trust must be built and maintained. Strand teaches that lesson continuously. By mid-morning, I could feel comprehension settling across the room. The analysts took notes carefully. The oversight officers asked clarifying questions and wrote summaries. I kept my explanations precise, never oversimplifying, never assuming. Complexity that is not understood invites error. Clarity creates responsibility. During the final exercise, I walked them through the logs of the Helix incident. They saw what happens when a system is used by people who forget the rules. They saw how Strand would prevent the same mistakes in real time. The room was silent. Some of the analysts looked astonished, as if they had just understood what it meant to be truly accountable. After the session, I sat alone for a moment. Outside, the city was alive, humming with energy. People crossed streets, rode bicycles, walked dogs. The world carried on while the system I built continued its work quietly. The logs had recorded the lesson. The edge triggers were active. The custodianship circle remained unbroken. Everything was as it should be. A message arrived from oversight, excellent demonstration. Lesson understood. Continue with training. I replied with one word, acknowledged. In the late afternoon, I walked along the river. The water reflected the soft sunlight, glinting like thousands of tiny signals. I thought about the journey, Helix, the firing, the pause, the creation of Kane integrity systems, and now Strand. The twists and pauses had taught everyone who looked closely what I had always known. Integrity cannot be optional. It must be embedded, observed, practiced. I wrote one last note in my notebook before leaving the river. Power lies not in authority but in adherence to principle. Teach this first. Everything else follows. By evening, I returned to the office, closed the laptop, and watched the lights of the servers blink steadily. The system had passed its test. It would continue to teach, to pause, to observe, and to enforce responsibility, not through fear, but through design. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to smile. The twist of Helix's misstep, the pause that became a lesson, the oversight that ensured accountability, all of it had created a system that would endure. Strand was alive, and through it, the code of integrity would continue to guide those who were willing to learn. I left the office quietly, walking under the amber glow of streetlights, feeling that, at last, the lesson was safe, the system breathing, and the future ready to receive it.